If capitalism is the reason for all our social economic issues, why were families in the US able to live off a single income for decades and everything cost so much less? The character of capitalism post-WW2 was very different from earlier in history and from today. The destruction of capital stock and labor shortages following the war led to workers having a lot of bargaining power, higher wages, and more comfortable lives in the decades after the war. In France they call this period https://en.m.wikipedia.org/wiki/tront_glory uses. As the world recovered from the war, the proportion of all income earned in the economy that was earned by owning capital increased. Because of this, a smaller proportion of overall income earned was earned from labor, and this led to increased income inequality. If you'd like to read a better sourced version of this, look for A Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. At that time, global capitalism was still in its infancy. Capitalism doesn't work without constant growth, which works for a while. But once everyone is in the workforce, women, minorities, immigrants, and there are no new resources or counties to exploit, the only way to increase profits is to reduce costs, layoffs, wage reduction, or price increases. It's not an infinitely sustainable system. Constant growth is, on its face, impossible, but that keeps being ignored. Loss of regulations and taxes on the wealthy around Reagan's time? Also during World War II most of the world's industrial infrastructure got bombed to shit while ours got modernized. That was gonna give us a boost for a few decades sorta no matter what. They also had unions and high-paying jobs that provided benefits for their families and pensions for their retirement. We have not only stripped away regulations protecting workers, but put laws in place to oppress workers on par with developing countries. Also, the wealth inequality gap was not what it is today. The rich didn't take or make what they do today. A dollar went a lot farther because things weren't as expensive. There weren't giant corporations with virtual monopolies that lobbied for high barriers to entry that keep people from starting small businesses. So there was actual competition and the average person could get a few years of work under their belt and then go off and start their own business. Today we are kept prisoner to the corporations who own our professions. You, and a concerning number of responses in this thread, have got your causality backwards. Single-income families are a sign of low prosperity. People stay home to do menial household labor when their earning potential on the job market is not enough to cover the cost of paying for technology that obviates that labor. Through a combination of social discrimination against women in education and the workforce, and technological, labor-saving devices being invented and becoming cheaper over time factors, it has become more common for women to be able to command salaries high enough that the opportunity cost of staying at home became unacceptable to most. Capitalism is a terrible term to use in any social scientific context because it's got so many definitions that are so incredibly contradictory. You will inevitably end up in a debate in which everyone is arguing angrily without actually disagreeing on anything more substantive than the definition of capitalism. For example, the economists typically argue capitalism didn't start until Adam Smith's time in the late 1700s, which means that slavery was a thing capitalism inherited from previous eras like feudalism or mercantilism. Numerous other fields consider slavery to be part of capitalism and argue that it is inherent to capitalism. Ergo, when you start talking about capitalism, you are almost certainly going to say something that goes against everything at least one social science teaches. Which means you will have an entire pack of PhDs calling you stupid, basing their argument on numerous well-done academic work, etc. As for your question, I have been spending time with economists lately, so I will give the economists' answer. People's expectations changed. Income is up quite a bit since 1960, so people are clearly making more money. The costs they complain about tend to be costs that are directly tied to wages, i.e., a heart doctor could only see X patients in 1960, if he can only see X patients in 2024, medical costs will have increased at the same rate as wages. So let's look at an actual example. My maternal grandfather was a top patent attorney in Detroit. His 4 children, wife, and mother-in-law lived in a house that had a single bathroom. They had approximately 300 square feet. A person. If you spend $250,000 for a house in that neighborhood today, you're wasting at least half the money, because it's not a $250,000 neighborhood. He had 1 car. The children attended public schools. Childcare was grandma and my great-grandma. The vast array of monthly bills people pay today, Netflix, Prime, cable internet, cell phone, etc., simply did not exist. Eating out wasn't a thing very often, even on Monday when Grandma spent the entire day reading the Sunday New York Times and had to scramble like a madwoman to produce something edible before Grandpa got home. My mom was the baby, and everyone thought she was spoiled because she got ballet lessons and Grandpa took her to every ballet recital she wanted. Today you could do all of that on Amazon's salary of $15 an hour. 1 car. 3 adults, one of whom receives Social Security. 4 kids, but no childcare expenses. A couple monthly bills, electricity, heat, mortgage, landline. Car is an old Corolla. Education is Detroit Public Schools. Medical care is Medicaid. Your biggest problem is likely to be auto insurance, which was always shockingly high when I lived in Detroit. This is 2010-ish. This method is precisely how religiously conservative groups, with low education levels, manage to raise big families. So the difference is that we simply expect more. Great-grandma needs her own house and her own space. The situation on Marseilles Avenue, where Aunt Chris was exiled to great-grandma's room after excessive sister torture of Aunt Liz, would not be acceptable. If you're doctorate level and you have your kids in a Detroit neighborhood, it had better be one of the $600K house ones, or people think you don't love your kids. Nobody's going to a Detroit public school if it isn't a magnet school. Childcare has to come from someone you pay money, who is highly educated. The 1953 decision of Rumley versus United States blew the top open for congressional corruption. It allowed congressmen to make money, hide money, and create huge advantages as the incumbent to stay in office, with no reporting requirements and no oversight. This gave wealthy corporations direct influence over how the post-war economy was changing. It was no longer in Congress's best interest to protect American households, but rather, they could become rich while in office through corporate sponsorships. Since then, lawmakers have had an express and direct incentive to vote against anything that would limit corporate or industrial freedoms. Or vote against wage increases, voting against anything that would limit price increases in things like insurance costs, loan interest, government subsidies for already profitable industries, or any of the other decisions that have allowed things to get so out of hand in the US. It wasn't instant, it took decades to fully mature, and Reagan just piled more of the same on in the 80s, as well as cementing the idea of tax cuts for the rich, which gave rise to the CEOs of today making 500x the salaries of their employees and paying zero tax through loopholes that complicit lawmakers sold their votes for. Capitalism might work, but that's not really what we have anymore. Maybe some sort of oligarchy? I don't know all of my isms well enough to say what the US has become.